Hey guys, tonight we're doing something a little dangerous. We're stepping into a candlelit great hall in the Middle Ages, where the air smells faintly of roasted venison, beeswax, and the kind of perfume you only get when rose petals have been boiled for hours in copper pots. And somewhere between the clink of goblets and the slow strum of a lute, you spot it. The tiniest of glances between two people who absolutely should not be making eye contact. You know the look. It's not the "oh hey nice weather" look. It's the "I will break every unwritten rule for you" look. The trouble is, in this era, you probably won't survive this. People have been exiled, humiliated, even executed for far less than a stolen gaze. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. I'm not here to twist your arm, I'm here to twist your brain into wondering how humanity managed to make romance both the most beautiful and the most hazardous sport in history. And while you're here, tell me, what city are you in, and what time is it right now? I love imagining all of us gathered together, scattered across time zones but united in curiosity. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The great hall is cavernous, the rafters dark with centuries of smoke, candles gutter in iron sconces, making the shadows flicker like restless spirits on the wall. At the far end, the lord of the castle sits in a high-backed chair, looking disinterested in the entertainment. He's heard all these songs before, but you're transfixed, because you're watching the performers, and you've already caught on that the lyrics aren't quite as innocent as they seem. The troubadour sings about a fair flower in a garden locked away, and when his eyes lift from the strings, they find hers, Lady Isabel, the lord's wife. That's your first historical fact for the night. Many of the love stories in medieval poetry were never meant to be about everyman romances. They were coded, stylized, and aimed squarely at the aristocracy. Troubadours didn't just entertain, they wove emotional landmines into verse. Some were allegories, some pure flattery, and some not so fictional. You can almost hear the social tension humming like the strings of the lute. The servants move quietly through the hall, refilling cups, eyes lowered. But the walls have ears here. And you know the wrong servant catching the right moment could destroy reputations, and yet, in a strange way, that risk is the point. Courtly love in the Middle Ages thrived on danger. The more forbidden the connection, the more intoxicating it became. And here's your quirky fact: some medieval lovers apparently communicated entirely in handkerchief code. A dropped kerchief at a tournament wasn't just clumsiness, it might be a signal that the lady would meet her knight after dark. Imagine living in a time when forgetting your laundry could be a political act. The fire in the great hearth pops, sending a shower of sparks up the chimney. A servant brings more wine, and the lord finally cracks a smile at some bawdy jest from his steward. He doesn't notice, or pretends not to notice, that Lady Isabel has shifted slightly in her seat. Enough to face the performer, their eyes lock for a fraction of a breath. If you blinked, you'd miss it. And here's where the scholarly debate kicks in. Historians can't quite agree on whether courtly love, as described in medieval literature, was a real cultural practice or just an elaborate literary fantasy. Some argue it was a genuine code of behaviour, secret affairs, elaborate gestures, vows of service woven into aristocratic life. Others think it was basically the medieval version of a Netflix period drama, heavily romanticised, mostly for entertainment, and not actually how people behaved in real life. In moments like this, standing in the flicker of torchlight, you could believe either. The troubadour's voice dips low for the last verse, a near whisper against the plucked melody. You sense the audience leaning in, caught between curiosity and propriety. Outside the high windows, the night is black velvet stitched with cold star. Somewhere in that darkness, the real drama of this castle is playing out, not in the hall, but in the spaces between the rules. You shift your attention to the far corner of the room, where a man in a dark hood stands very still. He's no guest, probably a scribe or a clerk, someone tasked with remembering the important faces and noting the important alliances, but his gaze is sharp, and you get the distinct feeling that he's not missing a thing. In a world without modern tabloids, gossip travelled in the mouths of people like him. The song ends, and there's polite applause. The troubadour bows, but not before glancing one last time at Lady Isabel. It's almost imperceptible, that flicker of recognition between them. But you catch it. And so does the man in the hood. The air thickens. Conversations start again, but you can feel the invisible threads tugging between people in the room. In the centuries to come, poets would call this kind of longing refined and ennobling, the idea being that unfulfilled desire could make a person more virtuous. But right now, in this hall, you're not so sure virtue is what's on anyone's mind. The way she clutches her goblet a little too tightly suggests she knows exactly how precarious her position is. Your eyes wander to the embroidered tapestries hanging on the wall, scenes of knights kneeling before ladies offering flowers or falcons. They tell a neat idealized version of love, pure, loyal, destined to inspire great deeds. But here's the uncomfortable truth. In real life, these stories had consequences. People lost titles, lands, and sometimes their lives over the wrong kind of affection. A servant trips, spilling wine, and the tension breaks for a moment as laughter ripples across the level. The lord claps the poor man on the back, more amused than angry. But when you glance back toward Lady Isabel, she's already looking away from the troubadour, her expression carefully smoothed into bland politeness. The night moves on, more songs, more food, more polite conversation. But you know the story here isn't in the official entertainment. It's in the pauses, the silences, the almosts. You wonder if they'll speak again tonight, or if they'll wait for some shadowed corridor where no one's supposed to see them. You wonder if centuries from now, anyone will even know their names, or if their glances will just dissolve into the great anonymous tide of human longing. For now, the only thing certain is that this is far from over. The hall eventually empties, though the faint smell of roasted meat and candle wax still lingers in the air, like the aftertaste of a half-remembered dream. You slip through a side corridor, the kind where the rushes underfoot have gone a bit stale, their grassy scent edged with damp. The night beyond the castle walls is cold, but here in the cloistered stone belly of the keep the warmth lingers. And somewhere, drifting through the corridor's narrow echo, you hear it. A voice, low, melodic, threaded with a rhythm you recognize from the great hall. You follow the sound and find him, the troubadour. His lute is cradled against his chest like a sleeping child. He's not singing for an audience now, he's whispering verses into the shadows, as though trying to fix them in his mind before they vanish. You realize this is no ordinary song, these are lines meant for someone specific. And just as you're piecing that together, a figure steps out from another hallway, cloak pulled up, hood low. Lady Isabel. They don't touch, they don't dare, but the air between them is electric. She speaks first, barely above her breath, in the kind of language that rolls slow and musical. You can't catch every word, but you know the tone, equal parts warning and longing. He replies in verse as if poetry itself could hide the meaning from unwanted ears. That's the thing about courtly love. Sometimes the performance isn't for the court at all, it's camouflage. Here's your historical fact. Troubadours were more than entertainers. They were cultural messengers, carrying not just stories but coded political commentary and, yes, declarations of passion. Many were trained in the art of Troubadours, closed or hidden poetry where the meaning was intentionally obscure unless you were the intended recipient. It was the medieval version of speaking in a code only two people could understand. A draught slides down the corridor, carrying the faint smell of wood smoke and something herbal, lavender, maybe, from the lady's garments. She holds something in her hand, a folded scrap of parchment, edges frayed as if handled too often. She tucks it quickly into the troubadour's sleeve, the motion smooth and practiced. You get the sense this isn't their first exchange, and yet the risk is immense. Here's your quirky fact. Some troubadours, when caught in compromising situations, would claim their verses were about an entirely fictional ideal lady called the Domna. This imaginary muse was their legal and social safety net. Of course, in more than a few cases, the fictional lady bore an uncanny resemblance to an actual noblewoman in the audience. From somewhere deep in the castle, a bell tolls the hour. They step apart. She turns first, disappearing into the darkness with the soft swish of silk against stone. He watches her go, face unreadable, then tucks the lute under his arm and vanishes into another passageway. You're left in the empty corridor, listening to the echoes fade. This is where the scholarly debate creeps in again. Some historians argue that relationships like this were rarely, if ever, consummated. The point, they say, was the yearning itself, the perpetual chase, the transformation of desire into art, music, and manners. Others disagree, pointing to court records full of trials and punishments for illicit affairs. Looking at that parchment disappearing into the troubadour's sleeve, you're not entirely convinced that restraint was the rule here. You retrace your steps toward the outer door of the hall. Outside, the castle's inner courtyard lies under a spill of moonlight. A few guards pace the battlements, their spears catching glints of silver. You spot a small group of servants heading toward the stables, whispering and laughing, one of them balancing a basket of apples on her hip. The castle never truly sleeps, it just shifts into a quieter rhythm. You pause near a well at the centre of the yard. The water smells of damp stone and iron. Across the way, you see the troubadour again, now speaking to a tall, thin man with a feathered hat. Another performer, maybe, or a messenger. He's gesturing with one hand, the other still holding the sleeve where Isabel's letter hides. He's not reading it here. Not yet. Maybe not until he's far from these walls. Somewhere beyond the gate, a wolf howls. The sound is low and long, more mournful than threatening, but it makes you glance at the sky. The moon hangs high, cold and pale, and for a moment you wonder how many secret meetings like this it has watched over, how many half-spoken verses and stolen glances it has stored in its silent archive. You take one last look at the troubadour before slipping away. He's already moving toward the stables, perhaps to find a place where no one will think twice about him, humming to himself. Maybe he'll write the rest of her song tonight, or maybe he'll burn the letter before dawn. With courtly love, the line between immortal verse and total erasure is razor thin. Morning comes slow in the castle, the pale light of dawn seeping through narrow slit windows, turning the stone walls the colour of old parchment. You wake to the sound of boots on the wooden gallery above you, guards changing shifts, and the faint aroma of baking bread drifting up from the kitchens below. Somewhere in the outer ward, a rooster is already making a nuisance of itself. You wander toward the training yard, drawn by the clatter of steel on steel. Here the knights are at practice, their armour glinting where the rising sun hits it. Squires run back and forth with water buckets, clothes, and spare weapons. The lord of the castle stands at the edge of the field, arms crossed, watching his men with the detached interest of someone who knows the real test of loyalty isn't always in the fight. And then you see him, tall, broad-shouldered, visor raised to reveal a square-jawed face, and eyes that keep flicking toward the gallery above. You follow his gaze and spot Lady Isabel leaning over the railing, a pale blue veil draped from her headdress. She's not smiling, not waving, not doing anything that could be called obvious, but her attention is locked on that knight like a moth to a torch. Here's your historical fact. In the chivalric code, knights were expected to dedicate their feats to a lady, sometimes wearing her colours in a sash or ribbon during a tournament. Publicly, this was framed as an act of inspiration and moral uplift. Privately, it could be the boldest confession possible without speaking a word. The knight's opponent lunges, and the clash of blades rings sharp in the morning air. The watching men cheer, but you're more interested in the moment between blows when his hand adjusts a strip of fabric tied just above his elbow, pale blue, matching the veil on the gallery. It's not much, but in a place where everything is watched, it's enough to make your pulse quicken on their behalf. Here's the quirky fact. Some tournaments in the 12th and 13th centuries became so overrun with love games, ribbons, songs, secret dedications, that church authorities condemned them outright, claiming they distracted knights from the more honourable business of bashing each other for feudal glory. Apparently, the danger of a flirtation was right up there with the danger of a sword to the head. The match ends in a burst of applause, and the knight steps back, bowing, not to the lord, but to the gallery. It's quick, subtle, but you notice. So does the hooded clerk from the night before, standing near the practice yard with a wax tablet in hand. He scribbles something before walking off, lips pressed tight. You can't decide whether he's recording the history of this place or collecting ammunition. The debate among scholars would tell you this is the kind of moment that divides opinion. Was this courtly love simply an elevated form of admiration, a way to turn lust into polite theatre? Or was it a deliberate, coded courtship, dangerous and real under all the pageantry? Looking at the tension in that knight's jaw, the way her knuckles whiten on the balcony rail, you suspect this is no harmless game. The yard clears as the sun climbs higher. The lord is called away by a steward, and the lady disappears from the gallery, her skirts whispering against the wooden boards. The knight remains, leaning on his sword, head bowed as if in thought. You almost approach, curious to see what he'll do next, but he suddenly turns and heads toward the stables, where you saw the troubadour disappear the night before. You follow at a distance. The stables smell of hay and horse sweat. The air warmer here despite the draught through the open doors. The troubadour is there, seated on a bale of straw, plucking his lute with idle fingers. The knight says something you can't hear, and the musician nods, slipping a hand into his sleeve to withdraw a folded piece of parchment. Recognition sparks in your mind. It's the same letter Lady Isabel gave him. The exchange is quick. The knight tucks the letter into his gauntlet and pulls his visor down, hiding his expression. No words, no smiles. He mounts his horse and rides out through the postern gate, as if headed for routine patrol. The troubadour watches him go, then strums a single sharp chord, letting it echo in the dusty air before he goes back to his song. You lean against the stable door, wondering how many people in this castle know about these threads of connection, weaving through tournaments and performances and hushed corridors. You wonder how long they can keep weaving before the threads snap. You slip out after the knight, keeping to the edge of the courtyard where the morning shadows still cling. His horse's hooves strike a steady rhythm against the cobblestones as he takes the narrow lane that winds down from the castle's inner gate. The guards at the postern hardly glance at him, just another patrol heading out for the day, but you know better. There's a letter tucked in his gauntlet, warm from his skin, and that's not the kind of cargo knights are meant to be carrying on official duty. Beyond the gate, the path dips into the village clustered under the castle walls. Smoke rises from the chimneys of low timber-framed houses, curling into the crisp air. A baker's boy hurries past with a basket of round loaves, the smell of yeast and wood fire trailing after him. Chickens scatter underfoot as the knight passes, the villagers offering shallow bows or cautious nods. A knight in armour is still a spectacle here, no matter how familiar. He turns off the main road, guiding his horse toward a small stone chapel set apart from the bustle of the market square. Its bell tower leans slightly, as if it has been listening too long to the confessions inside. He dismounts, leaving the horse tethered to a post, and disappears through the low wooden door. You follow, ducking your head to pass under the arch. Inside, the air is cool and smells faintly of incense. Candles gutter on the altar, their flames bending in the faint draught from the door. A single monk is here, kneeling in prayer, his brown robes pooling on the flagstones. The knight walks past him without a word and heads toward the rear of the chapel, where a narrow stair spirals upward into the bell tower. Here's your historical fact. Chapels in the Middle Ages weren't just for worship, they were also neutral meeting grounds. Messages could be passed under the guise of religious duty, and certain areas, like the bell tower or sacristy, offered privacy if you knew when to slip in unnoticed. It was a loophole in the otherwise suffocating rules of noble life. Halfway up the stair, the knight pauses. He pulls the parchment from his gauntlet, turning it over in his hands. You see his shoulders tighten, then relax, as if he's steeling himself. He climbs the rest of the way and emerges into the dim chamber beneath the bells. And there, leaning against the wall with his arms folded, is another man. Not the troubadour. This one's dressed plainly but neatly. A clerk, perhaps, or a messenger in service to some other noble house. His face is long and narrow, and his eyes sharpen when he sees the letter. The knight steps forward, holds it out and says something too low for you to catch. The man takes it, slips it into a leather satchel and nods once. No pleasantries, no lingering, a transaction pure and simple. Here's your quirky fact. Some letters in the medieval courts were written not in standard script, but in cipher. Simple substitution codes or even symbols disguised as decorative flourishes. To the untrained eye, it might look like an illuminated poem. To the right person, it was as clear as spoken words. The messenger leaves first, his boots thudding softly down the stairs. The knight remains in the bell tower for a moment, leaning on the wooden railing and looking out over the village. From up here, the thatched roofs look like a scatter of sleeping animals huddled against the chill. His armour glints faintly in the muted light, and you can't tell whether he's feeling triumphant, guilty, or simply resigned. The debate that historians still can't quite settle hums at the back of your mind. Was courtly love a way to inspire nobility toward higher ideals, or was it a carefully disguised rebellion against the rigid boundaries of marriage and class? Watching this knight, you can see it might be both, noble in intent, rebellious in execution. He descends at last, his step slow, the faint jingle of chainmail echoing off the stone. Outside, the horse whickers softly at his return. He mounts without hesitation and rides back toward the castle, his visor lowered now, as if cutting himself off from the gaze of the village. You linger a moment longer, looking at the chapel door. Somewhere out there, the messenger is already halfway to another castle, another set of guarded walls, another person who will read that folded scrap of parchment and feel the jolt of dread they were never meant to hear aloud. Whatever is written there, It's travelling faster than gossip, and that's saying something. The village around you hums with its own quiet rhythm, hammering from the blacksmith's shop, laughter from the tavern, the splash of water at the communal well. Life goes on, oblivious to the threads of intrigue stretching over it like spider silk. You turn back toward the castle, knowing this web is only going to get more tangled. By the time you reach the castle again, the sun is higher, burning away the mist clinging to the battlements. The great hall has emptied from breakfast, leaving only a few servants sweeping rushes and clearing the trestle tables. In the quiet, you notice details you missed last night. The grooves in the stone floor worn by centuries of boots, the tapestry seams slightly uneven where repairs have been made by less than patient hands. You pass through the hall and into a smaller chamber off to the side, where a long table is littered with scraps of parchment, inkpots, and a scattering of wax seals. A man sits at the head of the table, quill scratching steadily across the page. His robes mark him as a cleric, though his tonsure is only half shaved, as if interrupted mid-ritual. He glances up as you enter, his expression cool but not unfriendly. On the table before him is a small manuscript, no larger than your hand, bound in dark leather. The script inside is delicate, each letter looped and flourished. You lean closer and realize it's not scripture, it's poetry. Here's your historical fact. Some of the earliest rules of courtly love appear in treatises like De Amore by Andreas Capellanus, written in the late 12th century. Ostensibly a guide to refined romance, it lists conditions like marriage is no excuse for not loving, and a true lover does not desire the embraces of anyone but his beloved. To modern eyes, it reads like a mix between etiquette manual and relationship manifesto, except this was never officially sanctioned by the church or the crown. The cleric sees you reading and, without looking up from his writing, murmurs, "Not for public eyes." His voice is low, but there's a faint twitch at the corner of his mouth, as though he enjoys the secrecy more than he should. He gestures toward a small chest at the side of the table. The rest is in there, locked, of course. You glance at the chest, iron-bound, with a keyhole shaped like a stylized heart. A little on the nose, you think, but effective. The cleric dips his quill again, the scratch of nib on parchment filling the room. His hand moves with practiced speed, the ink forming lines you suspect are less about divine matters and more about human ones. Here's your quirky fact. Some manuscripts on love were deliberately written in a mixture of Latin and the local vernacular, so that the meaning could shift depending on the reader's fluency. A common reader might think it was moral instruction, while a more educated or better informed reader would catch the romantic undertones. It was plausible deniability in literary form. A door creaks open at the far end of the chamber, and Lady Isabel enters. Her veil today is white, edged with tiny pearls, and she carries herself with that deliberate grace that makes her seem untouchable. She doesn't look at you, she looks straight at the cleric. Without a word, she slides a folded parchment across the table. He places his hand over it briefly, as if blessing it, then tucks it into the manuscript he was copying. The entire exchange takes less than 5 seconds. You wonder if this is how the rules truly survive, not as lofty philosophy, but as a living, breathing system of signals, objects, and people willing to risk everything for a line of verse. Historians can argue over whether courtly love was real or imagined, but standing here, you can feel its weight in the room. The cleric finally looks up at you. "There are things the law forbids, yet the soul commands," he says almost absently. "The trick is to write them so they look like neither." He returns to his work, dismissing you without another word. You leave the chamber, your head buzzing with the idea that somewhere in this castle there might be an entire hidden library of such manuscripts, half confession, half defence, and if they exist here, they must exist elsewhere, carried by messengers, guarded by troubadours, hidden under floorboards or inside reliquaries no one dares open. In the corridor outside, the hooded clerk from before is leaning against the wall. He doesn't acknowledge you, but his eyes follow as you pass. You wonder how much he's already pieced together, how many of these exchanges he's recorded on that wax tablet. He's not a poet, and you doubt he cares about ideals. He's watching for leverage, not love. You take the long way back toward the courtyard, passing through a narrow gallery where sunlight slants through arched windows, illuminating motes of dust like tiny golden sparks. Somewhere above, a pigeon coos from the rafters. The air smells faintly of ink and candle wax, and you realise you're still carrying the image of that iron-bound chest in your mind. What would happen if it were opened? Who would it damn? Who would it save? In the end, perhaps the rules of courtly love aren't written in books at all. They're written in the silences between words, in the pauses before a hand touches another, in the careful choice of blue over red when tying a ribbon. And as you step back into the sunlight, you can't shake the feeling that someone, somewhere, is already writing you into one of those rules. The afternoon sun slants across the courtyard, catching on the armour of a pair of guards at the main gate. You drift toward the outer bailey, where the castle meets the noise and movement of the village beyond. On the edge of the market square, a wooden table has been set up, and behind it sits a man in a fur-lined robe, flanked by 2 clerks with rolls of parchment. At first, you think it's some kind of court proceeding, but then you notice the couple standing nervously before the table, each holding a small pouch of coins or a folded document. You've stumbled into a marriage contract day. The scribe dips his quill, asks questions in a clipped voice, and writes with mechanical precision. The couples glance at one another in stiff silence, answering only when spoken to. The man in the fur robe, not a priest but an official of the Lord's household, nods curtly when the coins are counted, the agreement signed, and the names entered into the record. There's no music, no flowers, no laughter, just ink drying on a promise that has almost nothing to do with love. Here's your historical fact. In much of medieval Europe, marriage among the nobility was a matter of property, alliance, and inheritance. Love, if it had appeared at all, was an afterthought. Even for commoners, the local lord's approval was often required, and marriages could be annulled if they threatened political or economic interests. The church recognised marriage as a sacrament, but it was the legal contract that mattered most to the world you lived in. You watch as a young woman, her veil plain and her hands tightly clasped, steps up to the table with a man old enough to be her father. They exchange no words, just a brief glance before she signs her name. You can't help but think of Lady Isabel and her knight, and how utterly impossible it would be for them to meet here, in the open, and sign their names side by side. Here's your quirky fact. In some medieval towns, there was a tradition called hand fasting, where a couple could be considered married if they publicly declared their union and clasped hands before witnesses, without any formal contract. The church eventually tried to stamp this out, worried it gave people too much freedom to choose their partners. The official calls for the next pair. You move on, crossing the market square where traders shout the virtues of their wares, salted fish from the coast, dyed cloth from Flanders, knives with polished bone handles. Somewhere behind the shouts, a fiddle scrapes out a tune, but it's drowned by the bartering. The debate among scholars threads into your thoughts again. Was courtly love an escape from the grim practicality of arranged marriage, or was it a luxury only the privileged could indulge in because their economic survival was already secured? Watching the merchant's daughter slip a ribbon into her lover's hand while her father haggles over the price of wool, you think it might be both. A sudden shout draws your attention back to the contract table. A man is refusing to sign, his voice tight with anger. The clerk insists, pointing to a line on the parchment, but the man spits on the ground and storms away, dragging a young woman, presumably his intended, behind him. The official shakes his head, muttering about stubborn fools, and beckons the next couple forward. You leave the market behind and take the road uphill, back toward the castle. The difference is immediate. The noise fades, replaced by the muffled clop of hooves and the whisper of wind through the trees. You pass under the shadow of the gatehouse, where the guard on duty yawns and nods at you. Inside the walls, the air feels heavier, quieter, as though every stone has absorbed centuries of unspoken bargains. In the great hall, preparations for the evening meal are already underway. Servants move like a well-rehearsed dance, carrying the jugs of ale, stacking trenchers, polishing the silverware. At the far end of the room, Lady Isabel is speaking to the steward. Her posture is perfect, her voice calm. But her eyes flicker with a restlessness you can feel even from across the hall. Somewhere a door opens, and the troubadour steps in, lute slung over his back. He bows to her in passing, just enough to be proper, but his eyes hold hers for the briefest moment. No parchment changes hands this time, no words are exchanged, but you get the sense they don't need them, not when the rules of this game are older than either of them, older than the castle itself. You realise now that courtly love exists precisely because of what you saw today, those stark business-like contracts that bind without touching the heart. Love becomes an act of rebellion, not because it's illicit, but because it's irrelevant to the system meant to govern human bonds. And in that irrelevance, it becomes dangerous. As the hall fills with the smell of roasted meat and the crackle of the hearth fire, you know this quiet rebellion is far from over. Somewhere the letter sent this morning is being read. Somewhere another set of eyes is narrowing in suspicion. And here in the warm flicker of the great hall the game continues. The next morning the castle feels half asleep, the air heavy with the cool damp of the early dawn. You find yourself in the west wing, where the narrow windows catch only slivers of light and the smell of lavender clings to the rushes. Here is the domain of the ladies in waiting, a world that hums quietly beneath the pomp of the great hall. One of them, a slight young woman with dark hair tucked under a linen coif, sits on a bench near the window, mending a sleeve. Her name, whispered in passing, is Aveline. She works with quick, neat stitches, but her eyes keep darting toward the door. It's not until the corridor falls completely tissé that she slips a hand into the basket at her feet and draws out a folded piece of parchment. The seal is a blob of deep green wax, pressed with a crest you recognise from the Lord's household. Here's your historical fact. Ladies in waiting were more than attendants. They were often trusted intermediaries in matters too delicate for servants and too dangerous for the noble themselves. Because they moved freely between chambers, they could pass letters, tokens, or whispered messages under the guise of ordinary duties. In courts where everything was watched, they were both the safest and riskiest messengers you could choose. Aveline tucks the letter under the folded sleeve she's mending, pinning it into place with a single, hidden stitch. Anyone glancing at her would see only fabric in her lap, or she gathers her sewing basket, stands, and moves into the corridor with the quiet, unhurried pace of someone who knows she must appear invisible. Here's your quirky fact. Some love letters in the Middle Ages were written on edible wafers of rice paper, or thinly rolled pastry dough, meant to be eaten immediately after reading, leaving no trace. If the message fell into the wrong hands, it could be destroyed in seconds. You suspect this letter is far too thick for pastry, but the principle feels the same. Concealment is survival. Aveline's path winds through the castle like a stream finding the lowest places. She stops here and there, adjusting a tapestry, handing a comb to another attendant, greeting a guard with a polite nod. Each pause makes her movement seem natural. By the time she reaches the outer garden, she's nothing more than a lady with a mending basket on her way to take the air. The garden is quiet, dew still beading the grass. Under the linden tree at the far end, a man in plain clothes tends to a row of rose bushes, pruning away the dead blooms. His back is bent, but his eyes flick toward her as she approaches. She kneels beside a stone bench, sets down the basket, and pulls out the sleeve she's been working on. With her free hand, she brushes away a stray leaf from the bench, tucking the letter beneath it. No words pass between them. The gardener finishes trimming, collects the fallen petals, and as he passes the bench, his hand moves briefly to lift the sleeve. By the time he reaches the far gate, the letter is gone. Aveline gathers her things and walks back toward the keep. Her expression calm, her pace unchanged. The scholarly debate circles back in your mind. Was this kind of clandestine exchange part of a widely accepted code, or just a necessary improvisation by those desperate enough to risk it? Some argue that courtly love operated within a shared understanding among the elite, that everyone knew, but as long as appearances were kept, it was tolerated. Others insist the danger was real, the consequences severe, and every step like Aveline's was a calculated gamble. From your vantage in the garden, you can still see the bench now empty. The roses stir in a faint breeze, and somewhere overhead, a bird begins to sing. You realize how easily you could have missed the entire transaction, how many others might have walked through the garden this morning and noticed nothing at all. That's the true craft here, making the extraordinary vanish into the ordinary. Aveline disappears back into the castle's shadowed halls. The gardener, letter hidden somewhere in his tunic, slips through the side gate toward the village, and you, caught between curiosity and caution, decide to follow. You keep to the wall's shadow as the gardener disappears down the slope toward the village. His gait is unhurried, the easy stride of a man with nothing to hide, at least to the casual eye. The path curves past a stand of poplars, their silver leaves flickering in the morning light, and then into a narrow lane between hedgerows. You can smell damp earth and the faint sweetness of crushed mint underfoot. The village itself is already busy. Smiths hammering in their forges, women drawing water from the well, a group of children chasing a stray goose through the muddy street. The gardener nods to a few people but doesn't stop, heading instead toward the far end where the houses thin out and fields begin. There he turns toward a low hill crowned by the same linden tree you saw in the castle garden. A cousin to it, perhaps, older and broader, with a thick trunk gnarled like an old storyteller's hands. He sits on a low stone at the base of the tree, pulling from his tunic the folded parchment. The green wax seal catches the light for a moment before he breaks it with a thumbnail. He reads quickly, his lips moving but making no sound, then tucks the letter inside the leather pouch slung over his shoulder. The pouch, you notice, is not a gardener's tool bag. It's too fine, the leather oiled and well stitched, the clasp shaped like a falcon in flight. Here's your historical fact. Linden trees were a traditional meeting place in medieval villages, often considered neutral ground for gatherings, dances, or even minor court proceedings. In poetry and song, they became symbols of romantic rendezvous, shaded from the world but still rooted in it. Lovers in troubadour verses often met under the linden to speak freely away from watchful eyes. The gardener, if that's even his true role, glances down the hill, scanning the path. A moment later, a cloaked figurity appears, moving with a swift but careful step. The hood hides her face, but the pale blue hem of her gown peeks out as she walks. She stops a few paces away, and only then pulls back the hood. It's Lady Isabel. Here's your quirky fact. Some noblewomen carried 2 sets of outer garments, one for public display, rich and heavily decorated, and another plain enough to pass for a servant's. The second was for travelling discreetly within or just outside castle grounds, a kind of medieval incognito mode. They speak quietly, their voices nearly lost in the rustle of the linden leaves. You catch fragments. Safer this way, and he rides at dawn. She doesn't reach for the letter, which tells you the man under the tree is a courier, not a messenger of return. Whatever's written will travel far beyond the village, perhaps even to a nearest noble house. The scholarly debate tugs at you again. Are you watching the machinery of a political alliance dressed up as rowants, or a true love affair shielded by the methods of espionage? The Middle Ages didn't draw clean lines between love, power, and strategy. Sometimes the same letter could serve all 3 purposes. A sudden noise cuts through the stillness. Hoofbeats on the road below. Both turn their heads sharply. 2 mounted men are approaching, wearing the livery of the castle guard. Lady Isabel steps back into the shade, pulling her hood up again, while the gardener moves to the other side of the tree, bending, as though inspecting the roots. The riders pass without stopping, but the moment leaves the air tense. When the road is clear, Isabel steps forward again, resting her hand briefly on the courier's arm. No smile, no lingering, just a touch, and then she turns and walks back toward the village. He waits until she's nearly out of sight before slipping the letter deeper into his pouch, then heads off in the opposite direction, toward the river that cuts through the fields. The linden's branches sway overhead, their leaves whispering secrets you can't quite catch. You stand there a moment longer, the sun warm on your back, wondering how many such meetings this tree has witnessed. The ground beneath it is worn smooth, as if countless feet have stood in the same patch of shade, speaking words meant only for 2. You decide to follow the courier to the river. If he's taking the letter beyond the Lord's lands, the real story might just be starting. By the time you catch up to the courier, the sun has climbed higher, bleaching the river into a sheet of bright silver. He moves along the bank with the steady, unhurried rhythm of someone used to covering long distances, occasionally stopping to scan the far shore. When he reaches a narrow wooden bridge, he doesn't cross. Instead, he veers onto a track that hugs the river towards the sound of distant cheering. The noise grows with each bend, the ring of metal, the thud of hooves, and the swell of voices rising in unison. You crest a small rise and see it, an open field outside a neighbouring lord's keep ringed with wooden stands draped in banners of red, gold and deep green. This is no market fair, it's a tournament. Here's your historical fact. Tournaments in the 12th and 13th centuries weren't just sporting events, they were showcases of power, diplomacy and social theatre. Knights fought for honour and for the favour of ladies, often dedicating their victories to them in public displays that blended genuine admiration with calculated politics. The courier slips into the crowd at the edge of the lists where merchants hawk roasted meat and sweet wine, and children dart between legs clutching pastries. His hood stays low, and you notice he avoids the main gate to the stands, instead edging toward the cluster of tents where the competing knights keep their squires and gear. The lists are already alive with spectacle. 2 knights thunder toward each other on massive destriers, lances lowered. The clash is bone-shaking, the splintering wood drawing gasps from the crowd. One knight is unhorsed, tumbling into the dirt, while the other circles back, raising his lance toward the stands, where a row of ladies sit in fine gowns. A gloved hand tosses him a ribbon. Silk, pale blue. You don't need to guess which lady that colour echoes. Here's your quirky fact: ribbons, sleeves, or kerchiefs from a lady that could serve as tokens, worn by knights during a tournament. But the same fabric could carry more than symbolism. Letters were sometimes sewn into hems or linings, letting messages travel in plain sight. The courier weaves between tents until he reaches one marked with a green falcon on white. Inside, a knight is seated on a stool, armour half buckled, visor pushed back to reveal a face flushed from exertion. The courier kneels briefly, producing the leather pouch. The knight takes it without opening it, slipping it beneath a folded surcoat. Their exchange is swift, almost casual, but you feel the tension in the air, a tightness that doesn't belong to the din of the tournament. The scholarly debate creeps into your thoughts as you watch. Did the chivalric theatre of tournaments genuinely serve to elevate love into an ennobling force, or was it simply a flashy backdrop for clandestine dealings? The public dedication to a lady's colours could be pure romance, or a deliberate smokescreen for messages and plans far more dangerous. A trumpet blast calls the Green Falcon Knight back to the field. He rises, adjusting his armour, and steps out into the sunlight to mount his horse. As he rides into the lists, you notice the faint bulge under his surcoat where the pouch rests. The match begins. His lance catches his opponent's shield with a crack like breaking oak. The crowd roars. You glance toward the stands and see a lady in a green-edged gown watching with unreadable eyes. She is not Lady Isabel. The courier slips away from the tent while all eyes are on the field. You follow, weaving through the stands to the edge of the lists. The smell of trampled grass and horse sweat fills your nose, the ground vibrating with the charge of hooves. The courier heads toward a small knot of people gathered near the far end, beyond the official enclosures. There, under the shade of a canvas awning, sits a man dressed not like a knight, but like a merchant, rings on every finger, a velvet cap tilted low. The courier bows, leans close and says something that makes the merchant's smile widen just enough to show gold teeth. The merchant presses a coin into the courier's palm, then waves him away. You realise the letter may have already passed through 3 hands since it left Lady Isabel's chamber, each exchange cloaked by the noise and pageantry of the tournament. Out here, no one's watching the quiet business in the shadows. They're all too busy cheering for the next collision of steel. The trumpets sound again, announcing another round. The Green Falcon Knight salutes the stands, the blue ribbon fluttering from his arm. The crowd thinks it's a gesture to his lady. You suspect it's also a signal, meant for someone who's not watching from the public benches at all. As the lists erupt in another thunderous charge, the courier melts into the crowd, already moving on to his next task. You follow, knowing this trail is only getting harder to trace. The tournament's noise fades behind you as the crowd begins spilling back toward the market stalls. The courier is gone, lost in the shuffle of bright pennants and muddy boots, but the blue ribbon remains in your mind, a flash of silk that could mean everything or nothing depending on who's looking. By the time you return to the castle, the great hall is already buzzing with post-tournament chatter. The lord sits at the high table, retelling the day's best jousts to a cluster of guests, while servants hurry between benches with platters of roasted fowl and fresh bread. Near the back, Lady Isabel listens politely to a visiting lady's endless account of her family's hounds, but her gaze drifts toward the far wall, where a servant is hanging a collection of trophies from the day: broken lance tips, a polished helm, and the ribbon. It hangs neatly on a peg beside the helm, looking innocuous enough. Pale blue, slightly frayed at the edges. The steward claims it came from the lists. A gift from a gracious lady to the Green Falcon Knight, returned as a mark of his victory. But you catch the way Isabel's fingers tighten on the stem of her wine cup. Here's your historical fact. In many medieval courts, personal items exchanged between a knight and a lady could be considered evidence in cases of impropriety. A glove, a belt, or a ribbon, if proven to belong to a married woman, might be enough to start a formal inquiry. The logic was simple. Possession implied favour, and favour implied intent. The ribbon draws other eyes too. The hooded clerk you've been noticing for days appears in the corner, making notes on his wax tablet as the steward explains its origin. You wonder how many quiet scandals have started with such an innocent display. Here's your quirky fact: some nobles kept entire collections of love tokens won or gifted during their lives, but the meaning of each item wasn't always romantic. Some were marks of political allegiance or even bribes disguised as favours. Without the story, a token is just a scrap of cloth. The danger is in the stories people decide to tell about it. The scholarly debate hums at the edge of your thoughts again. Some argue these exchanges were harmless games, part of the ritualised theatre of courtly love. Others point to surviving legal records of ruined reputations and stripped titles, suggesting that what began as play could quickly turn into ammunition in the wrong hands. Standing here, watching the clerk's stylus scratch across wax, you feel the danger is real enough. The ribbon doesn't stay on the wall for long. As the meal winds down, a young page plucks it from its peg and carries it toward the dais. He kneels before the Lord, presenting the silk as if it's a war trophy. The Lord laughs, waving it away, but not before glancing toward his wife. It's only a moment, but the glance is sharp, like the glint of steel before a strike. Isabel's smile never falters. She thanks the boy, tells him to return the ribbon to the knight who won it. But when the page turns away, she signals, just a flick of her fingers, to Aveline, the lady in waiting you saw with the letter. Aveline rises from her bench and follows the boy out of the hall. You slip after them, careful to keep to the shadows. In the corridor, the boy hands the ribbon to Aveline without question and darts off toward the kitchens. Aveline examines the silk, fingers tracing the stitching along the hem, then tucks it into her sleeve. It's too deliberate to be simple retrieval. She disappears into the maze of servant passages, and you follow until the air turns cool and damp the lower storerooms. Here, in a small chamber lit by a single oil lamp, Aveline meets the troubadour. No loot tonight, just a leather satchel slung over his shoulder. She passes him the ribbon, and he, in turn, slips it into the satchel with the same care one might give to a relic. "Tell her it's safe," Aveline says quietly. "And tell him?" The answer is yes. The troubadour nods once, tightening the satchel's strap. He leaves without another word, and you stand frozen, the implications unravelling in your mind. The ribbon isn't just a token, it's a reply. A coded message, sewn into the hem perhaps, or written in thread only visible up close. You linger in the dim room, listening to the drip of water from somewhere deep in the stone. Above you, the castle hums with music and laughter, but down here the air is thick with something else, the knowledge that silk can cut as sharply as any blade. The next day the castle is humming with a different kind of energy. No jousts or market bustle today. This is the quieter pulse of court business, when petitions are heard, disputes settled, and alliances tested behind heavy doors. You find yourself drawn toward the solar, a sunlit chamber draped with embroidered hangings and strewn with cushions, where the ladies of the court gather to sew, gossip and observe without seeming to. At first glance, it's a serene scene. Lady Isabel sits near the window, a frame of fine embroidery balanced on her knees. A few other noblewomen are scattered around the room, each with their own work, while Aveline moves between them, pouring watered wine into delicate silver cups. But you've been here long enough to recognise the undercurrent. Every glance, every half-smile, every idle question is another piece in an invisible game. The door opens, and a man steps inside, a courtier from another household, dressed in deep green, trimmed with fur. His hair is oiled and curled in the latest French fashion, his expression one of pleasant confidence. He greets the room politely, but keeps his gaze fixed on Lady Isabel. The conversation shifts subtly, threads of talk weaving into pauses long enough for unspoken messages to pass. Here's your historical fact. In medieval courts, seduction wasn't always about romance. It could be a deliberate strategy to gain influence, secure patronage, or sway decisions in matters of land and law. A well-placed smile or a carefully chosen compliment could be as effective as a signed treaty, especially when delivered in the presence of others who could spread the right version of the story. The courtier takes a seat near Isabel, asking after her embroidery. She tilts the frame toward him, the sunlight catching the silk threads so they shimmer like water. His hand lingers near the edge of the frame, close enough to be suggestive, far enough to be innocent. Around them, the other women pretend not to notice, their lowered gazes hiding sharp attention. Here's your quirky fact. Some medieval embroidery included hidden motifs, tiny knots, extra stitches, or patterns visible only on the reverse side. that served as private jokes or messages between the maker and the intended recipient. A rose with one petal deliberately misplaced could signal something far from floral. The courtier leans in, murmuring something that makes Isabel's lips curve in the faintest smile. You can't hear the words, but you see the reaction ripple outward. Aveline's head tilts slightly. Another lady's needle pauses mid-stitch, and in the corner, the hooded clerk appears again, silent as a shadow. He's not here for the sewing. The scholarly debate flickers in your thoughts. Was courtly love genuinely an art of refinement, elevating those who practiced it, or was it simply a socially acceptable mask for manipulation and ambition? Watching Isabel, you suspect it can be both at the same time, sincerity and strategy folded together like layers of costly cloth. Their conversation drifts toward the upcoming feast, and the courtier casually mentions he's bringing a gift from his lord, a casket of Venetian glassware, rare and valuable. The implication is clear: generosity now, in hopes of favour later. Isabel nods graciously but offers nothing more than a polite thanks. Her restraint is part of the game. Too much interest would make her vulnerable, too little, and she risks offending an ally. The clerk slips out as quietly as he entered, and you wonder whose version of this scene will end up on his tablet. Perhaps he'll record it as harmless conversation, or perhaps as evidence of something brewing beneath the surface. In a world where words can be twisted into weapons, truth is a fragile thing. The courtier finally rises, offering a formal bow before leaving. The moment the door shuts, the room exhales. One of the older ladies chuckles softly, another raises an eyebrow at Isabel, and even Aveline allows herself a knowing glance. No one names what just happened. They don't need to. As you step into the corridor, the faint sound of footsteps follows. The courtier is already halfway down the hall, speaking in low tones to the steward. You catch a fragment. Her answer will come soon enough. Whether he means an answer of the heart or of politics, you can't yet tell, but in this place those two are often the same thing. By late afternoon, the air in the castle grows heavier, as if the stones themselves are holding their breath. You wander toward the library, a vaulted room lined with shelves of calfskin-bound manuscripts and scrolls, their spines labelled in Latin, French, and the occasional burst of Provençal. It smells of dust, old ink, and the faint tang of lamp oil. Here the clatter of armour and the gossip of the hall fade away, replaced by the low murmur of voices. At a long oak table near the centre, two men sit across from each other, their robes marking them as scholars. One is grey-bearded, his ink-stained fingers drumming on a closed volume. The other is younger, with the quick, restless eyes of a man who has already decided he's right. Between them lies an open manuscript, its pages illuminated with delicate vines and gilded initials. You edge closer and realise it's a copy of De Amore. The older man clears his throat. Andreas writes clearly, "The purest love is unconsummated. It elevates the soul, restrains base impulses, and inspires noble deeds." His tone is that of someone reciting a truth too obvious to dispute. The younger man leans forward, tapping the page. Elevates? Perhaps. But if love is never acted upon, is it not just? He pauses, searching for the word. Es performance? Cage built of verse and sighs? Here's your historical fact. De Amore, on love, written by Andreas Capellanus in the late 12th century, explicitly distinguished between true love, which should remain chaste, and mere lust, which was condemned. This idea took deep root in the literature of courtly love, shaping the ideal of yearning as nobler than fulfillment. A third voice joins in, this one from a slender monk seated a few tables away, who's been pretending to copy a psalter but clearly listening. "And what," he says, not looking up, "of the trials recorded in the bishop's courts? If consummation never occurred, why so many punishments?" That earns a wry smile from the younger man, because the line between thought and act is thinner than the ink on this page. Here's your quirky fact. Some medieval courts staged mock trials of love disputes, complete with allegorical witnesses and judges, where questions like these were debated in public for amusement. In one famous example from the court of Eleanor of Aquitaine, the verdict was that real love cannot exist within marriage, since marriage is bound by law rather than free will. The older scholar frowns at that. Marriage is not the enemy of love, it is its fulfillment. "Tell that," the younger one says dryly. to the lady who must smile at a man she never chose while giving her eyes to another. The monk finally looks up, his quill pausing mid-air. Perhaps, he says softly, love is a sin only when it's weak. A strong love, whether pure or not, can defend itself. His words hang in the air, and you see both scholars exchange a glance that could be agreement or unease. The scholarly debate, alive here in the lamplight, feels sharper than the one you've been carrying in your own head. You can sense how easily these words could slip from philosophy into accusation, depending on who heard them and how they were repeated. Aveline appears briefly at the doorway, glancing into the library as if checking for someone. She spots you, hesitates, then slips away without entering. You file that away. Her timing is rarely accidental. The older scholar finally rises, closing the manuscript with care. Younger men will always chase the flame, he says, but wiser men know it is the light, not the heat, that guides us. He nods politely to his counterpart and leaves, his robes whispering over the stone floor. The younger man lingers a while longer, staring at the closed book. Then, almost absently, he traces a single letter in the gilded margin with his fingertip, a letter shaped like a heart pierced by an arrow. He closes the volume, slides it back onto the shelf, and leaves without another word. The library falls silent again, save for the scratch of the monk's quill and the faint pop of a lamp wick. But the question lingers in the air. If love never crosses into the physical, is it truly love, or just a beautifully wrapped lie? Night settles over the castle with the slow certainty of ink seeping into parchment. The day's debates and whispers fade into the background hum of preparation for the evening's entertainment. In the great hall, the rushes have been swept clean, fresh candles placed in iron sconces, and the scent of spiced wine drifts in from the kitchens. Servants bustle about, laying out benches for the musicians and making sure the long trestle tables are perfectly aligned. By the time the guests gather, the air is warm and buzzing with anticipation. At the far end of the hall, near the dais, a tall, wiry man in a crimson tunic stands tuning a lute. His hair is cropped short, his eyes bright with the restless energy of a performer about to take the stage. He's no castle resident. You can tell by the way he glances around, mapping the room with a newcomer's awareness. Word is, he came from the southern provinces, where the songs run bolder and the rhymes sharper. When he begins, the music is light, almost playful, verses about hunting, the changing seasons, and the clumsy antics of an unlucky squire. The crowd chuckles in the right places, clapping in time with the chorus. But then, as the second song starts, the tone shifts. The chords grow slower, the melody more winding. His voice dips low, caressing certain words with deliberate weight. Here's your historical fact. Travelling minstrels often walked a fine line between flattery and provocation. A clever performer could win favour with a noble audience by weaving in veiled compliments or gentle satire. But step too far, hint too directly at scandal, and you risked far more than an empty purse. The song paints a picture of a lady trapped in a tower, her beauty the prize in a tournament no one can win. He describes the knight who rides for her favour, not in the lists but in the shadows, where moonlight sharpens the truth. The imagery is unmistakable to anyone who's been paying attention to the undercurrents in this hall, and when his gaze lingers, however briefly, on Lady Isabel, a ripple moves through the crowd like wind across tall grass. Here's your quirky fact. In some courts, if a minstrel performed a song that was too daring, the noble in question could demand amende honorable, a public apology in verse which had to be composed and performed on the spot. For a skilled bard, it was a challenge. For a careless one, a trap. Isabel's expression remains perfectly serene, but the lord's brow tightens. His goblet pauses halfway to his lips. Across the hall, the hooded clerk has stopped writing and is watching with the stillness of a hawk about to strike. The minstrel doesn't falter. His fingers glide across the strings, the words growing sharper. Some knights win gold, some win land, but the rarest prize is a glance unearned, a smile unseen by the sun. Aveline, standing just behind Isabel's chair, shifts uncomfortably, her eyes flicking toward the dais steps. By the time the song ends, the applause is polite but thin. The lord leans toward his steward, speaking quietly. Moments later, two guards move through the hall, their boots thudding against the flagstones. They stop beside the minstrel, who bows slightly as if he expected them. One guard takes his lute, the other gestures toward the door. The scholarly debate resurfaces in your thoughts. Some historians claim such public punishments were more about controlling narrative than protecting morality. A dangerous song could plant an idea in a dozen minds before dessert was served. Remove the singer quickly enough and the story might die in the cradle, or grow in the telling depending on who whispered it next. The minstrel is escorted out, his crimson tunic vanishing into the shadow beyond the torchlight. Conversation in the hall resumes, but it's subdued, as though everyone is pretending not to replay the lyrics in their minds. The Lord raises his goblet again, smiling as if nothing happened, but his eyes are darker now. You slip out into the corridor and catch a glimpse of the guards leading the minstrel toward the outer gate. He doesn't look frightened, only resigned. Like a man who has sung this close to the edge before. At the gate, one guard hands him back his lute and murmurs something you can't hear. The minstrel nods once, steps into the night, and disappears into the cold air beyond the walls. Above you, the moon is rising, a thin silver coin in a deep blue sky. Somewhere out there, the song will be remembered, repeated, perhaps even altered until it no longer resembles the truth. But the seed has been planted, and you suspect it will find fertile ground. The morning after the minstrel's abrupt exit, the castle feels oddly muted, as if the stone walls themselves are holding on to the echo of his song. You wander into the eastern courtyard, where a few squires are scrubbing tack and polishing bits of armour. The air smells of wet leather and ash from a nearby forge. It's here, by the open stable doors, that you notice something that doesn't quite fit. A nobleman, tall and impeccably dressed, standing far too close to a young woman in a plain wool dress. She's holding a bucket of water, her hands red from the cold, and her head is bowed. But even from a distance you can see the quick flash of her eyes when he speaks. There's no mistaking the intent in his posture, leaning just enough to be intimate, careful to keep his voice low so it won't carry. Here's your historical fact. In medieval Europe, relationships across class lines were heavily discouraged and, in some cases, punishable. For a nobleman, being caught in an affair with a servant could mean political disgrace. For the servant, it could mean dismissal, banishment, or worse. The unwritten rules of courtly love generally assumed both parties were of similar rank. Crossing that divide was not part of the romantic ideal. The girl laughs softly at something he says, quickly covering her mouth as if the sound might draw attention. He reaches for the bucket, his fingers brushing hers, and the contact is enough to make her freeze for a heartbeat. Then she pulls back, tucking a loose strand of hair under her quiff. The nobleman doesn't press. Instead, he glances toward the far end of the courtyard, where the steward is distracted by a delivery of firewood. Here's your quirky fact. Some castles had what were called whispering galleries or alcoves, small architectural quirks where sound travelled unusually well. Lovers would sometimes stand apart, appearing to ignore one another. While carrying on entire conversations in these echo-friendly spaces, it wouldn't surprise you if this stable corner worked much the same way. The nobleman says something else, and she nods, setting the bucket down beside the trough. Then she steps inside the stable, disappearing between the stalls. A moment later, he follows, glancing once over his shoulder. You hesitate, then slip in after them, keeping to the shadows. Inside, the smell of hay and warm animals is thick in the air. Horses shift in their stalls, the creak of leather harnesses mixing with the soft thud of hooves on straw. Toward the back, you catch sight of them. She's feeding an apple to a chestnut gelding, while he stands close enough to speak without raising his voice. You can't hear the words, but the way he's looking at her leaves little doubt. The scholarly debate rises in your thoughts. Was love across class lines ever truly possible in this world, or was it always a fleeting indulgence doomed by the weight of status and survival? Stories survive of knights abandoning titles for commoners, but for every romantic legend there are dozens of quiet tragedies where the ending was forced by law, family, or sheer necessity. They part suddenly at the sound of footsteps. Aveline, appearing in the stable doorway. Her eyes flick from one to the other, and in that brief pause you see calculation. She says nothing, simply hands the girl a folded cloth and tells her to bring it to the laundry. The servant slips away, head lowered, leaving the nobleman alone with the smell of hay and the cooling tension in the air. As Aveline leaves, the nobleman stands still for a moment, his jaw tight. Then he walks out into the courtyard, expression carefully neutral, but you saw the way his gaze followed her. And you suspect this won't be the last time they meet. The horses snort and shuffle, the only witnesses to what just happened. Outside, the castle hums with its usual rhythm, guards on the wall, merchants at the gate, kitchen smoke rising into the cold morning sky. But here, in the quiet of the stable, the air still feels charged, as though something delicate and dangerous just took root. 2 weeks later, the castle's mood shifts again. The corridors buzz with the clatter of trunks being dragged across flagstones and the creak of leather straps pulled tight on loaded pack horses. Servants hurry with bundles of cloaks, wool blankets and provisions, dried meat, cheese, loaves of dense bread that could survive the journey without moulding. The talk in the courtyard is all about the upcoming pilgrimage to the shrine of St. Alaric, a holy site a day's ride away. The Lord himself won't be going, his steward will represent the household, but several of the court's ladies have been granted permission to attend, Lady Isabel among them. You find her in the solar, surrounded by her attendants, her hands moving gracefully over a small wooden chest as she decides which ribbons and linens to bring. Her voice is light, almost casual, but you notice she's packing more than the usual finery for a pious journey. Here's your historical fact. Pilgrimages in the Middle Ages were often deeply spiritual undertakings, but they could also serve as socially acceptable excuses for travel. For nobles, they offered rare opportunities to visit other courts, conduct discreet diplomacy, or, as contemporary gossip sometimes hinted, meet lovers away from the suffocating eyes of home. Aveline appears in the doorway, carrying a folded cloak. She steps close, and as Isabel reaches to take it, something small slips from her sleeve into the folds of the fabric. The motion is so smooth it looks like nothing at all. Isabel sets the cloak aside without comment, but her gaze meets Aveline's for half a heartbeat. Here's your quirky fact. Some travellers carried pilgrim badges, small lead or pewter tokens stamped with the symbol of a shrine. In certain cases, these badges were deliberately altered, cratched or bent in a way that served as a private signal between two people who understood the code. To everyone else, it was simply a memento of devotion. The departure is set for dawn, and when the morning comes, the air is crisp enough to make your breath visible. Horses stamp and snort in the chill as the party gathers in the outer courtyard. The steward offers a blessing, invoking the saint's protection, while a handful of villagers kneel for their own petitions. The group moves out through the gate, banners fluttering gently above them. You ride along the edge of the column, noting how the formation shifts over the hours, some riders dropping back, others moving forward. By midday, the road curves into a stretch of open heath, where the wind carries the scent of heather and distant wood smoke. It's here that Isabel's horse slows, allowing a man in a dark riding cloak to draw level with her. His hood hides most of his face, but you recognise the build, the knight from the training yard weeks ago. They don't speak, not here, but as the road dips into a shallow valley, the group spreads out to navigate the slope. The knight's gloved hand brushes against hers on the reins just for a moment. It's enough to make you wonder whether the pilgrimage was planned for this very reason. The scholarly debate presses in again. Were such encounters spontaneous sparks of defiance, or carefully orchestrated manoeuvres hidden behind pious duty? Chroniclers often avoided recording the personal motives behind noble pilgrimages, leaving modern historians to guess at how many acts of devotion doubled as affairs of the heart. By evening, the party reaches a small riverside inn, its sign creaking in the wind. The steward orders food and lodging for everyone, and the group settles in for the night. You notice how the knight chooses a seat near the far wall, where he can watch the door, and how Isabel, after a suitable delay, takes the seat beside him. Aveline positions herself nearby, her presence a shield and an excuse for conversation. They speak in low tones over the noise of the common room, their words hidden by the clatter of tankards and the mutter of other travellers. Once, Isabel reaches for her goblet, and you see a thin strip of parchment pass from her hand to his, under the cover of the table. He doesn't look at it, just tucks it into his glove, as naturally as if adjusting the fit. Later, as the others retire to their rooms, you pass the knight in the corridor. His hood is down now, and you catch the faintest curve of a smile, private, unreadable, but enough to suggest that this pilgrimage is serving more than one purpose. Outside, the river murmurs under the moonlight, and somewhere a nightbird calls. You think about how far this letter will travel, not in miles, but in the space between two people bound by rules they cannot openly break, and you wonder how much longer the road to St. Alaric will remain free of obstacles. The pilgrimage party returns to the castle 3 days later under a pale, washed-out summer sky, the kind that promises rain but never quite delivers. By evening, the courtyard is quiet again, the banners furled, The horses led to their stalls. Life slides back into its familiar rhythm, at least on the surface. But you've been here long enough to sense when the currents are shifting beneath the calm. A few nights later, you find yourself in the kitchen's far corner, where the air is thick with the smell of wood smoke, onions, and boiling meat. Most of the staff are busy with preparations for the next day's feast, but at a side table, a hunched old woman works with a different set of ingredients. She's not on the kitchen's payroll. Her clothing is too rough, her hair streaked with ash from her own hearth somewhere in the village. On the table before her lies a collection of oddities: dried herbs bundled in twine, tiny glass vials filled with cloudy liquids, a pouch of something that clinks softly when she shifts it. Here's your historical fact: though this church officially condemned the use of magic in matters of the heart, the belief in love charms and potions was widespread in medieval Europe. Recipes survive in both Latin and vernacular texts, promising everything from stirring passion to ensuring fidelity, though the ingredients range from fragrant and harmless to outright poisonous. Aveline enters through the side door, glancing once over her shoulder before approaching the table. She doesn't sit. Instead, she leans in close, her voice low enough to be swallowed by the kitchen's clatter. The old woman nods, pulling a small wooden box from beneath the table. She opens it just enough for you to glimpse its contents: a scattering of dried rose petals, sprigs of rosemary, and something darker, curled like a scrap of leather. Aveline slips a coin into the woman's palm and takes the box. Here's your quirky fact: rosemary wasn't just for cooking, it was believed to strengthen memory and fidelity, making it a common ingredient in charms meant to bind a lover's affections. Worn in a braid or sewn into clothing, it was supposed to keep wandering hearts firmly tethered. The transaction takes less than a minute. Aveline disappears into the shadowed corridor, the box hidden beneath her cloak. The old woman lingers a while, muttering to herself as she packs away the rest of her goods. One vial slips from her grasp and rolls toward you, stopping at your boot. The liquid inside is pale green, flecked with something that catches the light like gold dust. You hand it back and her gaze meets yours, sharp, assessing, as though weighing whether you're a potential customer or a potential problem. The scholarly debate stirs again. Were these charms truly believed to work, or were they symbolic acts, a kind of psychological theatre? Some historians argue that the very act of seeking a potion or token could bolster confidence, making the magic more about the mind than the herbs. Others note the number of court records involving accusations of love magic, suggesting the belief was dangerously real to those who lived it. Later that night, you spot Aveline in Lady Isabel's chambers. The box is open on a small table beside the bed, its contents spread out as if being inventoried. Isabel touches one of the darker herbs with a fingertip, her expression unreadable. She picks up a length of ribbon, pale blue like the one from the tournament, and runs it through the sprig of rosemary before tying it neatly. To anyone else, it would look like a simple keepsake. Aveline says something that makes Isabel's lips curve into the faintest smile. The box is closed, the ribbon set aside, and the two women resume their conversation about the upcoming feast as if nothing unusual has passed between them. But when you step back into the corridor, the scent of rosemary follows you, sharp and clean, threading into your thoughts like a promise or a warning. Somewhere in the castle, the knight is going about his duties unaware, or perhaps entirely aware, that his next meeting with her will carry this invisible tether. Whether it's magic, symbolism, or simply the will to believe, the effect will be the same. You can't help wondering if the old woman in the kitchen knew exactly who her customer was working for, and whether she's sold the same binding to more than one client in this castle. After all, in a place where love is already a dangerous game, a little extra leverage might be worth more than gold. Rain finally comes, hammering the castle roofs through the night and leaving the courtyard slick and shining by the morning. The air smells of wet stone and sodden hay, and most of the castle's life has retreated indoors. You find yourself in the long gallery above the great hall, where portraits of long-dead lords glare down at you from their gilded frames. It's quiet here, too quiet, until the sound of hurried footsteps echoes up the stair. A young page bursts into the gallery, clutching something against his chest. His tunic is spattered with mud, and his hair is plastered to his forehead from the rain. He doesn't see you as he heads for the side door that leads to the steward's office. But halfway there, his foot slips on the wet flagstone, and the object he's carrying skids across the floor. It lands against the wall with a soft slap. A folded piece of parchment, the seal broken, edges damp from the weather. He scrambles after it, but not before you've caught a glimpse of the handwriting, tight, elegant script, unmistakably the same style you've seen in Lady Isabel's embroidery notes. He stuffs it back under his arm and disappears through the door, but the damage is already done. Here's your historical fact. In medieval courts, intercepted letters were a common weapon in political and personal disputes. A single phrase, if suggestive enough, could be twisted into evidence of treachery or immorality. The chain of custody mattered little. Possession was 9/10 of the accusation. Curiosity and caution push you to follow. In the steward's office, the page is standing before the hooded clerk, who takes the parchment with a look that's almost satisfaction. He lays it on the desk, smooths the creases, and reads in silence. You can't see the words, but you can see the faint upward twitch at the corner of his mouth. When he's done, he folds it carefully and tucks it into the ledger he always carries, as though filing it away for later use. Here's your quirky fact. Some nobles, aware of the risks, wrote personal letters in verse, making them seem like harmless poems. The trick was that certain words, read in a specific order, or by taking the first letter of each line, revealed the real message. Unfortunately, this disguise could be a double-edged sword. In the wrong hands, even an innocent poem could be read as dangerous code. The scholarly debate hums in your head. Did the culture of courtly love invite such dangers by romanticizing secrecy? Or did it simply provide a convenient cover for political spying? Watching the clerk slide the letter into his ledger, you can't shake the feeling that this isn't just about romance, it's about leverage. Later that day, you see the steward speaking quietly with the lord in the great hall. The lord listens, brows drawn together, while the clerk stands nearby like a shadow. You can't hear the exchange, but when the clerk hands over the folded parchment, the lord takes it and studies it for a long moment. His thumb runs over the damp edge where the seal once was. He says nothing, only hands it back, but the set of his jaw is harder than before. That evening, the atmosphere at supper is strained. Conversation is polite but thin, as if everyone senses the change in the air. Lady Isabel speaks little, though her expression remains perfectly composed. The knight is absent, sent on some errand perhaps, or kept away deliberately. Aveline hovers nearby, her usual light movements stiffened, her eyes scanning the room like a sentry. You can almost hear the unspoken question hanging between the tables. Who knows what and how much longer before someone decides to act on it? By the time the meal ends, the letter's whereabouts are a mystery again. The clerk has vanished from the hall, and so has the ledger. Somewhere in this castle the parchment rests, waiting to be produced at just the right moment, when its impact will be sharpest. You leave the hall with the uneasy certainty that it's no longer a matter of if the letter will be used, but when, and when it is, the damage will be irreversible. The storm has passed, leaving the air scrubbed clean and sharp, the sky a brittle blue. From the ramparts you can see the road stretching like a pale ribbon toward the horizon, still rutted with rainwater. A small group of riders approaches, 3 men in white mantles marked with the red cross of the Knights Templar. Their horses are mud-spattered but sure-footed, their faces shadowed by travel hoods. Word travels fast in a castle, and by the time the Templars are ushered through the gate, half the household has gathered in the courtyard. The Order's reputation precedes them, warriors sworn to poverty, chastity and obedience, bound by vows as severe as their discipline in battle. They are here, it's said, to speak with the Lord about securing safe passage for a shipment of goods along a troubled route, but that's not the only story circulating. Before the sun is high, the whispers have already begun, about one of the Templars in particular, a tall, broad-shouldered man whose visor never quite conceals the steel in his gaze. They say his name is Sir Renaud, and that somewhere in the south, before his vows, he left behind a woman whose memory follows him like a shadow. Some claim she was a noble's wife, others that she was a widow who nursed him back to health after a battle. In every version, the ending is the same. Their parting was forced, and her letters never reached him. Here's your historical fact. While the Templars' rule forbade personal possessions and romantic entanglements, there are scattered accounts, often from their enemies, accusing them of breaking these vows. Most of these stories are unverified, blurred by propaganda and rumour, but the persistence of such tales suggests they struck a nerve. You catch your first close look at Sir Renaud in the Great Hall later that day. The Lord and his guests sit at the high table, discussing routes and supply lists. His manner is reserved, his words precise, but there's a flicker in his expression when Lady Isabel enters with her attendants. It's not recognition exactly. more the subtle tightening of a man bracing against an unexpected gust of wind. Here's your quirky fact. In medieval lore, Templars were sometimes accused of carrying small relics or tokens hidden in the lining of their cloaks, objects said to bring divine protection. Romantic gossip twisted this, imagining such items as keepsakes from forbidden loves. Whether true or not, the idea fed countless ballads and whispered stories. The scholarly debate hums at the back of your mind. Were the Templars truly paragons of asceticism, or were they simply human men under extraordinary constraints, making their secrets all the more carefully guarded? The line between truth and fiction here is as narrow as a sword's edge. That evening, in the torchlit courtyard, you see Sir Renaud walking alone along the covered walkway. Aveline is there too, as if by accident, carrying a basket of linens. They pause in the shadow of a pillar. No one else seems to notice, but you do. Her hand dips into the basket, and when she pulls it back, a small folded scrap remains where the cloth shifted. He covers it with his gloved hand, the movement quick and sure. There's no telling whether the message is meant for him personally or for someone else entirely, but the next morning you hear that the Templars will be leaving sooner than planned. Their route will take them south, past several castles, including one that, if the rumours are true, might house the woman from Sir Renaud's past. When they ride out, Sir Renaud keeps to the middle of the formation, the scrap of parchment hidden somewhere beneath his mantle. You watch from the gatehouse as they disappear into the open country, the white of their cloaks fading against the pale road. Whether the story of his heart is true or not, the possibility is enough to keep the whispers alive, and in a court like this, whispers are a form of currency. The night after the Templars' departure, the castle throws a feast, ostensibly to honour visiting merchants from the coast, but everyone knows it's also to lift the mood after days of rain and tension. The great hall glows with candlelight, shadows leaping high along the smoke-darkened beams. The air is heavy with the scent of roasting meat, honey-glazed root vegetables, and the faint sharpness of wine warming in silver flagons. At first, the scene seems straightforward. Musicians in the gallery pluck out a lively tune on lute and harp. Servants weave between benches carrying trencher after trencher, and the guests lean toward one another in the friendly chaos of feast-day conversation. But your eyes drift past the noise to the patterns hidden beneath. Here's your historical fact. Medieval feasts were not only about eating and entertainment, they were prime opportunities for subtle displays of allegiance, flirtation, and political manoeuvring. Placement at the table, the passing of certain dishes, and even the timing of toasts could all carry carefully calculated meaning. Lady Isabel sits halfway down the Lord's table, her position close enough to speak with him when needed, but far enough to allow conversation with the guests near her. Across from her, the knight from the training yard, returned only yesterday, leans toward his neighbour, speaking politely, but every so often his gaze flickers toward her. It's never obvious, never direct, but you can feel the line of attention stretching between them. Aveline hovers at Isabel's side, pouring wine, adjusting the folds of her gown, and, if you watch closely, slipping small objects onto the table, a sprig of rosemary beside the goblet, a folded napkin placed just so, a morsel of candied quince nudged toward her plate. Here's your quirky fact. In some courts, the choice of food or drink served to a particular person could serve as a coded message. Sweetmeats might suggest affection, a salted dish disfavour, and a spiced wine could be an invitation to linger after the feast. The meanings varied from place to place, understood only by those in the circle. The knight's plate receives a piece of quince too, delivered by a passing servant who doesn't look to see where it lands. His hand pauses over it for a moment before he eats it, slowly, as though the flavour means more than it should. The scholarly debate edges in. You've read accounts suggesting such coded courtship was a literary exaggeration, while others argue it was an open secret in noble society, a game played in plain sight under the noses of those too disinterested or too polite to acknowledge it. Watching the easy rhythm of these gestures, you could believe either. Midway through the feast, the musicians shift to a slower melody. Conversation softens. Isabel lifts her goblet, and the knight across the table does the same, timed so precisely it feels rehearsed. They drink without looking at each other. Aveline's eyes flit between them, making the smallest nod, like a stage manager satisfied with a scene's delivery. Not all eyes are friendly. Down the table, the hooded clerk watches the exchange with the faintest smirk, as though cataloguing each detail for later. He scribbles something on a scrap of parchment, tucks it away, and returns to his meal. When the feast draws to a close, the Lord rises, offering a toast to his guests and safe travels on their return to the coast. Platters of sugared almonds and spiced pears make their rounds. Aveline slips a single almond into Isabel's hand, closing her fingers around it. The knight leaves soon after, but not before brushing past her chair on his way to the door. The contact is so slight it could be accidental, unless you saw the almond vanish from her hand into his. The hall empties slowly, guests drifting away in pairs or small groups. The musicians pack their instruments, servants scrape the trenchers, and the Lord disappears toward his private chambers. Only the faint scent of spiced wine remains. Lingering like the memory of unspoken words, you step out into the cool night air. The stars are sharp against the dark, the linden tree swaying gently in the breeze beyond the wall. Somewhere inside the castle, the almond now sits in the knight's hand, or perhaps in his pocket, its meaning clear only to him and the woman who passed it. And you can't help thinking that in this place the smallest gesture can carry the heaviest weight. A week later, the castle is alive with preparations for something far more elaborate than a feast. Servants hurry through the corridors carrying bolts of fabric, trays of feathers, and bundles of ribbons in every colour. In the great hall, carpenters are erecting a temporary dais and hanging garlands of evergreen along the beams. Word has spread, tonight will be a masquerade, a rare indulgence marking the signing of a lucrative trade agreement with a distant port city. By dusk, the transformation is complete. The hall glows with hundreds of candles, their light reflecting off polished silver and jewelled goblets. Musicians tune in the gallery, their strings and flutes weaving together into bright, expectant chords. At the door, guests are greeted with masks, some simple velvet half-faces, others elaborate constructions of gilded leather, painted wood, and curling plumes. The anonymity is intoxicating. Without a face to read, every voice feels like it could be telling the truth or lying beautifully. Here's your historical fact. Masquerades in the late medieval and early Renaissance courts were more than entertainment. They allowed nobles to mingle across rank lines without the constraints of formality, enabling flirtations, secret negotiations, and sometimes deliberate deception. What was said or done under the mask could be denied in daylight. You spot Lady Isabel almost immediately, not because her mask gives her away, but because of the way she carries herself. Even draped in peacock-coloured silk, her bearing is unmistakable. Aveline trails her, wearing a silver mask shaped like a fox's face, eyes glittering through the narrow slits. The knight is here too, though it takes you longer to find him. His mask is plain black, his tunic deep green, and he lingers near the edge of the crowd as if unsure whether to step into the current or watch it from shore. Eventually, the music swells into a pavane, and he drifts forward, meeting Isabel's hand without hesitation. Here's your quirky fact. In some courts, dancers at masquerades communicated with a system of touches, fingers pressed to the wrist for yes, the palm for no, or a certain number of steps forward and back to signal agreement, refusal, or caution. The uninitiated saw only graceful movement. The initiated read entire conversations in the rhythm. As they circle the floor, you notice those patterns in play. A squeeze of her fingers here, a pause in his step there. Between them, it's a quiet language of consent and warning. But the hall is crowded, and they were not the only pair exchanging secrets tonight. The scholarly debate threads through your mind. Some argue these gatherings were harmless, an outlet for social tension, while others claim they were perfect cover for conspiracy. Watching the swirl of masked figures, it's easy to believe the latter, especially when you notice the hooded clerk masked in gold moving between groups like a man collecting debts. Halfway through the evening, the trouble begins. In the crush of dancers, Isabel's mask is jostled, the ribbon at her temple loosening. The knight reaches to fix it, but a passing guest, masked as a horned satyr, deliberately tugs it free. For a moment her face is bare, framed by the startled hush that falls over the nearest circle of dancers. She recovers quickly, lifting the mask back into place, but not before several pairs of eyes, including the clerk's, have taken in the scene. The satyr bows mockingly and drifts away, vanishing into the crowd before anyone can challenge him. The music resumes, but the atmosphere has shifted. Whispers stir at the edges of the hall, feeding on the fact that the knight was the one closest to her when the mask came loose. They finish the dance, but there's no more coded touching. Aveline appears as soon as the music ends, offering Isabel a goblet and steering her toward the dais. The knight fades back into the throng, his mask still in place but his posture tighter, like a man aware that a line has been crossed in full view of too many witnesses. When the final song ends and the guests begin to unmask, the clerk is nowhere to be seen. You wonder what story he'll choose to tell tomorrow, and how much truth it will contain, because in a masquerade, truth is just another costume, and tonight, someone has already decided which pieces of it to keep. The first sign of trouble comes just before dawn. A horn blast from the watchtower, sharp enough to rattle the drowsy silence. You climb to the battlements with the rest of the household still shaking off sleep, the wind biting at your face. Beyond the walls, the early light reveals a grim sight. Banners snapping in the wind, a scatter of tents rising like dull mushrooms on the frost-hardened ground, and the distant glint of spear points. By mid-morning, the enemy has ringed the castle in a loose but deliberate cordon. No one goes out, no one comes in. The gates are barred, the drawbridge raised, and the smell of boiling pitch begins to drift up from the courtyard as the defenders prepare. The lord moves among his men, his voice steady but clipped, while the steward organises supplies with the cold precision of a man counting down to scarcity. Inside, the great hall becomes the nerve centre of the siege. Maps spread across the high table, messengers darting in and out with updates. Yet even here, with the thud of distant hammers building siege engines echoing faintly, the undercurrent of the court's private games hasn't vanished. If anything, the confinement sharpens them. Here's your historical fact. Sieges in the Middle Ages could last weeks or even months, and life inside the walls had to go on in some form. Meals were rationed, but feasts, albeit smaller, still happened. Religious services continued. Even dances or games might be held, partly to maintain morale, partly to deny the enemy the satisfaction of seeing fear. Lady Isabel is present in the hall, ostensibly to assist in managing the household's needs. She moves among the tables with calm efficiency, but you see the flick of her eyes toward the knight whenever he enters. He's been assigned to the wall towers, and his armour carries the chill of the morning air when he comes in to report. Their exchanges are brief, too brief, but the tension in them is unmistakable. Here's your quirky fact. During some documented sieges, lovers exchanged tokens across enemy lines, shooting them on arrows or floating them on small rafts down rivers, relying on luck and a little superstition to carry the message through. One chronicler even records a knight who sent his lady a single fresh apple every day of the siege, claiming it kept her in the bloom of her courage. The scholarly debate stirs again in your mind. Was love during such times a distraction from duty, or a vital act of defiance? Some argue that personal attachments could undermine command decisions. Others insist that holding on to desire was as much a survival tactic as stockpiling grain. By the third day, the tension inside the castle is its own kind of siege. People are sharper with one another, tempers fray. In that close pressure, small moments loom larger. One evening, as the hall quiets after the evening meal, you notice Isabel slip away toward the chapel. Minutes later, the knight appears, heading in the same direction with a pace that's purposeful but not hurried. You follow at a distance. The chapel is dim, lit only by the flicker of a few candles before the altar. She's kneeling in one of the side chapels, hands clasped in prayer. When he enters, he pauses near the doorway, head bowed as if in reverence. To anyone glancing in, they're simply two souls seeking comfort. But you see the slight shift of her hand, the way her fingers brush the hem of his cloak as he passes. Its contact so subtle it might not even exist unless you're watching for it. They remain in silence for several minutes before she rises and moves toward the door. Their shoulders nearly touch as they pass each other. And something, perhaps a folded scrap of parchment, perhaps nothing at all, changes hands in that breath of space. By the time you return to the hall, the Lord is in heated discussion with the captain of the guard about the enemy's latest manoeuvres. No one seems to have noticed that in the midst of tightening rations and sharpening swords, another kind of battle is quietly raging, one fought with glances, touches, and the fragile currency of trust. That night, as you lie awake listening to the muffled clang of the blacksmith working late, you realise the siege has changed nothing essential. The walls may keep the enemy out, but they can't stop the currents running inside. If anything, the pressure has only made them stronger. The siege drags on, but this morning the great hall is filled not with the smell of boiled grain or the sound of hammering, but with the hushed, tight-throated murmur that means something scandalous is about to unfold. Word has swept through the castle. A neighbouring noblewoman, the Countess of Belmar, has been brought inside the walls, not as a guest but as a prisoner. She arrives under guard, her crimson cloak rain-soaked and dragging on the rushes. Her face is pale but set, her eyes level as she walks the length of the hall to stand before the Lord's high table. The captain of the guard announces the charge: adultery, not whispered, not hinted at, spoken aloud in front of the entire assembled court. The alleged lover, a visiting knight from months past, now said to be in the enemy's camp beyond the walls. Here's your historical fact. In noble circles of the Middle Ages, accusations of adultery could serve multiple purposes: punishing personal betrayal, yes, but also removing political rivals or seizing their property. While church courts technically oversaw such cases, secular lords often handled them directly, when their own authority or alliances were at stake. The Countess's accuser is her own husband, the Count of Belmar, who steps forward in heavy fur and chain, making a show of righteous outrage. He claims to have intercepted letters, passages copied out by his clerk, but the originals conveniently lost in a fire. The clerk stands nearby with a ledger, looking smug in a way that makes you think of the hooded man in your own castle's shadows. Here's your quirky fact. Some medieval trials of adultery involved trial by ordeal for women, being made to walk over hot ploughshares or carry red-hot iron to prove innocence. Failure meant guilt. Survival was attributed to divine intervention. The practice was banned in much of Europe by the early 13th century, but the fear of it lingered in public imagination. Today the trial is less theatrical, but no less dangerous. Witnesses are called: servants who claim to have seen the Countess slip away during feasts, a stable hand who swears he once delivered a sealed letter to a man in a green surcoat. The Countess listens without flinching. When her turn comes, her voice is calm, almost bored. She says the green-clad knight was delivering messages on her husband's behalf, and the so-called love letters were devotional verses sent to her sister in a convent. The scholarly debate about courtly love flickers in your mind again. Some chroniclers saw accusations like this as proof of the dangers of romantic games, others as a cynical exploitation of them. Here, the blurred lines between love poetry and actual sedition seem to be working entirely in the husband's favour. The lord of your castle listens to both sides, his expression unreadable. After a pause, he announces that the matter will be kept under consideration until the siege ends. For now, the Countess will remain under guard in the East Tower. Gasps ripple through the hall, not because she's spared punishment, but because her fate is left hanging in the air like a blade over a fraying rope. Some eyes glance toward Lady Isabel, as if to remind themselves that, in such a climate, it wouldn't take much for one woman's private life to become another's public downfall. As the Countess is led away, she turns her head slightly, catching your gaze. There's no plea in her eyes, only a flash of something that could be defiance or the grim knowledge that once the court of rumour has passed judgment, the rest is just formality. That evening you pass the East Tower and see her silhouette in the narrow window lit from behind by a single candle. Outside the walls, the enemy's campfires glow faintly in the dark, and you wonder if the green-clad knight is out there, watching for her. Inside, the whispers are already reshaping her story, turning her into a warning, a weapon, or, depending on the teller, a tragic heroine. The siege finally lifts on a damp morning, the enemy melting away under a sky the colour of dull pewter. But instead of celebration, the castle greets the change with a kind of wary relief. Repairs begin immediately. Cracked stones in the gatehouse, splintered shutters, sections of wall blackened by pitch. In the Great Hall, however, another sort of work is underway. The chroniclers and poets are already deciding how this siege will be remembered. Among them is a young balladeer who arrived with the first wave of traders returning to the castle. He's lean and wide-eyed, carrying a battered vielle slung over his back and a satchel full of parchment scraps covered in half-finished verses. He listens more than he talks, lingering at the edges of conversations, scribbling furiously whenever someone drops a detail worth preserving or embellishing. Here's your historical fact. In the Middle Ages, news often travelled fastest through song. Ballads, whether sung by professional minstrels or passed between common folk, could carry stories across regions in days. They blurred fact and fiction freely, reshaping events into something memorable enough to survive in memory long after official accounts were lost or destroyed. One evening, the balladeer takes his place by the hearth after supper, the flicker of the fire catching in his eyes. The room quiets as he begins, not with the dry recitation of battles and names, but with the story of a lady trapped in a castle under siege, and the knight who risked everything to bring her messages through secret doors and shadowed chapels. The details are just vague enough to be safe, just sharp enough to set minds whispering. Here's your quirky fact. Some performers deliberately altered key details, changing the lady's gown from blue to red, or the knight's horse from black to grey, so the real people could deny any connection, even as everyone in the room knew the truth. This plausible deniability was part of the thrill, and it kept the singer from losing his tongue or his head. The scholarly debate flits across your mind. Do songs like this preserve history, or do they overwrite it? Some argue they're dangerous precisely because they feel truer than the truth, fixing details in the public imagination that may never have happened. Others point out that without such ballads, many personal stories, especially those of women, would vanish entirely from the record. As the balladeer sings, you see Lady Isabel at the high table, her gaze fixed not on him, but somewhere far away. The knight is absent again, out on patrol perhaps, but the room doesn't need his presence to keep the story alive. Every rhyme, every repeated phrase is another thread binding their imagined selves together in the minds of the listeners. When the song ends, applause ripples through the hall. Some guests shake their heads at the foolishness of such tales, while others exchange knowing glances. The balladeer bows, collecting a few coins, but you notice that one of the coins comes wrapped in a scrap of parchment. He slips it into his satchel without missing a beat. Later, in the quiet of the gallery, you hear him humming the same tune as he copies the words onto a clean sheet. He changes one line, just one, but it shifts the scene from a siege to a moonlit garden. You realise he's already begun preparing the next version, one that will travel farther, grow stranger, and maybe, eventually, outlive every person whose life it's borrowing from. By the time the fire burns low, the hall has emptied, leaving only the faint smell of smoke and the echo of a melody that will be sung in another hall in another town where no one will care which parts were true. And in that way, the story will keep breathing long after the last witness has gone quiet. The first hint of trouble arrives with the royal envoy, a tall man in the king's livery, his boots still dusty from the road. He's escorted straight to the Lord's Solar, where the doors close and the servants scatter, their expressions tense. By the time the meeting ends, the air in the castle has shifted, the way it does when a storm is coming but hasn't yet broken. Word filters out in fragments. The king's favourite, Sir Alaric of Vey, has been recalled to court under suspicion of conduct unbecoming his station. No one says the word treason, but they don't have to. Everyone knows that when a royal favourite falls, it's rarely a gentle landing. Some mutter about financial improprieties, others about a quarrel with another high-ranking courtier. But the whispers that grow fastest are the ones about a woman. Here's your historical fact. Royal favourites, men or women elevated by the king's personal trust, often walked a dangerous line. Their proximity to the crown brought influence, wealth and enemies in equal measure. Many fell not through proven crimes, but because they threatened another powerful faction or stirred the king's jealousy. Sir Alaric himself arrives 2 days later under a grey sky. His fine clothes travel-worn, but his bearing still unshaken. He's met in the courtyard with all the formal courtesy due his position, but there's a stiffness to it, as though everyone is calculating how quickly they might need to distance themselves. Lady Isabel is present among the greeting party, her expression unreadable. You notice how his eyes catch hers, only for a second, but with the faintest echo of recognition. Whether it's the first time they've met or not, something passes between them, as quick and sharp as a spark off flint. Here's your quirky fact. In some royal courts, accidental meetings between a favourite and someone else's wife or betrothed could be orchestrated by enemies. Knowing the appearance alone might be enough to plant suspicion. A single glance could be shaped into a full-blown scandal with a few well-placed witnesses. The scholarly debate stirs in your head. Was the downfall of such figures driven more by genuine misconduct, or by the dangerous politics of proximity to power? Chroniclers often recorded the accusation in great detail, but the evidence, if any, was vague, sometimes vanishing entirely after the favourite's disgrace. In the days that follow, Sir Alaric becomes a constant presence in the Great Hall, his manners flawless, his laughter just loud enough to draw attention without seeming forced. He plays dice with the younger knights, speaks learnedly with the scholars, and compliments the ladies on their embroidery and dancing. Yet every so often, you see him positioned where Lady Isabel will have to pass near him, close enough for a murmured word, never enough for the steward to object. It's Evelyn who confirms the rumours for you, her voice low as she pours wine at supper. "The king's heard there's someone here he cannot rival," she says, eyes fixed on the goblet, "and the court has made sure he believes it." Whether she means Isabel or another lady, she doesn't say, but the implication is clear. Alaric's enemies have found the perfect weapon. The turn comes swiftly. On the third evening, the hooded clerk, always hovering, always noting, delivers a sealed document to the lord. It's read in silence, then folded away, but you see the tightness in the lord's jaw as he calls for Alaric. There's no raised voice, no public accusation, just a quiet order to prepare for departure at dawn. The next morning Alaric rides out with only 2 attendants, his banner rolled, his cloak pulled tight against the wind. No one waves. By afternoon, the stories have already started to shift. Some say he was caught passing letters, others that he boasted too freely of the Queen's favour, still others that he spoke of love to a lady whose husband holds the king's ear. The truth, whatever it was, is buried under the weight of what people prefer to believe. From the wall you watch his figure grow smaller along the road, until it's only a dark smudge against the winter fields. Somewhere in the royal court he's returning to, a verdict has already been decided. Here his absence will settle like dust over the next days, silent but impossible to ignore. The winter has deepened, and the castle wears a hush like a heavy cloak. The air bites when you breathe it, and even the stables smell sharper, the scent of hay edged with frost. Dawn comes late these days, a pale wash of light creeping over the hills long after the fires in the great hall have been stoked. On this particular morning you are awake before the rest, drawn by the muted thud of footsteps in the courtyard below. You lean over the gallery rail and see Aveline moving quickly across the cobblestones, her cloak pulled tight, her breath rising in thin clouds. She heads not toward the kitchens or the chapel, but to the small stone building tucked beside the inner wall, the old guardhouse that now serves as a store for firewood. The door closes behind her, and you slip down the stairs to follow. Inside, the air is dim and smells of resin and smoke. The hearth in the corner is already lit, a small flame licking at the blackened logs. Aveline stands beside it with a folded sheet of parchment in her hands, the wax seal already broken. She isn't reading it, her eyes are fixed on the fire. Lady Isabel stands a step behind her, pale in the half-light, her hands clasped so tightly the knuckles show white. Here's your historical fact. Destroying letters was a common precaution in medieval courts. Written words once sent were dangerous, proof of alliances, confessions, or betrayals. Many nobles kept no personal correspondence at all, preferring verbal messages through trusted intermediaries. Burning was the surest way to erase a paper trail, though it sometimes fueled suspicion instead of quelling it. Aveline hesitates for a moment, as though the weight of the parchment is greater than paper and ink. Then she tosses it into the flames. The fire catches quickly, curling the edges, the wax bubbling before the words themselves vanish into ash. The 2 women watch until nothing remains but a fragile grey drift on the hearthstone. Here's your quirky fact. Some believed that burning a love letter released its contents into the air, carrying the message to the heavens or to the intended lover's spirit if they could not be reached in life. It was a superstition as much as an act of secrecy, a way to make destruction feel like a kind of preservation. The scholarly debate hums again. Is erasing such a letter an act of self-defense, or an act of finality, a conscious choice to sever the thread between 2 people? Historians argue over whether destruction protects the people involved or erases a vital part of their story. Watching the ash settle, you feel the truth might be both. Isabel exhales slowly, the sound almost like a sob but steadier, as if she's been holding it for hours. "No trace," she murmurs, and Aveline nods. Without another word, they leave the guardhouse, the smell of smoke trailing faintly behind them. You remain for a moment longer, staring into the hearth. It's impossible not to imagine what was written, whether it was a confession, a farewell, or a plan that could no longer be carried out. The ash is cooling now, sinking it into itself. You reach down, picking up a single blackened scrap that escaped the heart of the flames. The ink has blurred, but one word remains legible. Always. Later that day, the castle is busy again. Merchants at the gate, the clatter of hooves in the courtyard, the smell of baking bread drifting from the kitchens. But the guardhouse door stays closed, the fire inside banked to embers. Somewhere beyond these walls, the other half of the story exists, or perhaps it too has already been consigned to flame. By nightfall, the wind has risen, carrying fine snowflakes that hiss against the shutters. From your chamber window you see the linden tree swaying in the courtyard, its bare branches black against the sky. You think about all the glances, tokens and words that have passed under it, and how many of them have already been erased from memory, and you understand with a quiet certainty that sometimes history loses the truth not because it was never known, but because someone, at dawn, decided it was safer that way. So here we are, the fire burned down to embers. The corridor's quiet except for the occasional creak of timber or the muffled thud of a closing door. The castle sleeps, and with it, all those tangled stories, half of them truth, half of them invention, and most living somewhere between. You've walked through candlelit halls and rain-soaked courtyards, watched glances turn into risks, and risks vanish into ash. It's strange, isn't it? For all the rules they wrote and the codes they swore by, courtly love was never really about the rules at all. It was about what happened in the spaces between them. A ribbon left on a table, a sprig of rosemary in a goblet, the brush of a hand in a chapel when no one was looking. These were the gestures that carried more weight than any public vow. And yet they were also the most fragile, vulnerable to suspicion, jealousy, or the blunt edge of politics. History remembers the wars, the treaties, the grand marriages that merged kingdoms, but those didn't keep the linden tree swaying in the wind at night, or leave a half-burned word clinging to a piece of parchment. The quiet rebellions did that. The small dangerous choices people made for reasons they couldn't always name, or admit, or even fully understand. And maybe that's why these stories still hum in our imaginations. They remind us that even in an age when love could cost you everything, your title, your safety, even your life, people still reached for it. They still found ways to speak when they weren't allowed, to meet when the road was blocked, to hope when hope made no sense. The candles are guttering low now, the castle wrapped in darkness. Let the wind outside be your lullaby, and the echoes of these forbidden truths drift with you into sleep.